Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman. Welcome to my tutorial on painting the figure in watercolor. This is part one of a two-part tutorial, and in this part we will examine the reference photo, composition, values, storytelling, and lastly we will paint our background. The supplies I use in this first part of the tutorial include Arches cold press watercolor paper, 300 pounds. Because it's 300-pound paper, I will not stretch the paper. If, however, you are using 140-pound paper, I really recommend stretching it first. I did my line drawing with an F pencil and an eraser. My watercolor brushes are a black gold 311, size 6 and size 2. My watercolor paints are Daniel Smith professional grade, manganese blue hue and phthalo blue green shade, Hansa yellow light, burnt sienna, and sap green. You'll need water in a water container and paper towels. The reference photo is of a young boy, Iker. He's the son of a friend of mine. And my friend sent me several photos of Iker, and this is the one I ended up choosing. I liked the primary yellow of the bicycle, I loved the setting, and there were a lot of things that really worked in this photograph. But one thing that jumped out at me immediately that I didn't particularly like is that Iker's eyes are looking away from the viewer. Whenever we are setting up a subject to paint, we must consider what are we saying about the subject? What impression do we want to create? What story do we want to tell? One story is of a young child looking away. Another story is perhaps of a child with his eyes closed. And the story I wanted to tell was with the child looking straight at the viewer. With this image of him on a bicycle on the top of a hill, a summer sky in the background, in my head it really spoke to the idea of all the possibilities that we feel as children with the world at our feet, standing up at the top of the hill, looking straight ahead. So I needed to do a quick sketch to see if I could hold his head in this pose from the photograph and yet shift his eyes to looking to the viewer. If it didn't look right in a sketch, there was no point in spending time painting it. Maybe I would have to change the whole position of his head, but it's much easier to figure out beforehand with a quick sketch than to wait until you're quite a bit into the painting. So I did a quick 10-minute sketch of Iker's head in the same position as it is in the reference photo, but with his eyes changed from looking off to the side to looking straight at us. And I think it works just fine, so I don't need to change the position of his head in my reference photo. Once I had that figured out, I went back to studying my reference photo to see if I wanted to take any elements out or add any elements in. Again, I want to work towards whatever storytelling idea I have. Although I absolutely love the tree on the left-hand side of the image, it also seemed to be sort of boxing him in, and I decided not to include it. I also decided not to include the buildings in the background and the cement post in the middle ground by the tree. So I simplified what I saw in the reference photo to a line drawing that mostly is focused on Iker on his bicycle. I love the rolling hills in the background, and I included those as well, and some of the blades of grass in front, which gives us a really nice foreground. With the line drawing done, it was time to start thinking about values and my color palette. To start off my value studies, I turned the reference photo into a black and white image. I think it has really pretty good values. That light sky, a few darks, and overall a medium-toned image. But just to make sure, I played with a few other value schemes. Here you can see I really pumped up the contrast. A lot of dark, a lot of light, and very few medium tones. In this second study, you can see I really bumped up the medium tones. This is almost entirely medium tones with very little lights and a few darks. In this last value study, instead of just having one light, one medium, and one dark, I went with 4 values: a light, 2 mediums, and a dark. And I like it more. I want to paint towards this study. Lastly, before we can begin painting, we have to pick out our color palette. I chose a very limited palette using a mix of manganese blue hue with very watered down phthalo blue green shade for the summer sky. For that primary yellow bike, I am going to use Hansa Yellow Light. There's quite a bit of grass in this, and for the greener areas, I am going to use Sap Green as my base. I also mixed Sap Green and Hansa Yellow Light and compared it to Green Gold. I decided to just go with Sap Green mixed with Hansa Yellow Light for the lighter green areas. Some of the grassy areas has more of a tan, sort of yellowy golden hue. I could have introduced yellow ochre, but instead, to limit my palette, I decided to mix my own goldeny brown yellow hue by mixing Hansa Yellow Light with burnt sienna. For his hair and the bicycle tire, I will also use burnt sienna with indigo mixed together. And for lighter browns, I can use burnt sienna mixed with French ultramarine blue. He has a light complexion, and for that skin tone, I'm using Hansa Yellow Light mixed with quinacridone rose. And for the shadowy areas, I'm adding very watered down phthalo blue green shade. He's wearing a really cute outfit in the photograph, this camouflage top and bottom. But for a painting, I just felt like that's a lot of green with all the green of the hills behind him. So instead, I've decided to turn his pants into jeans using French ultramarine blue, and his hoodie will be white with a lot of shadows in it that will reflect the manganese blue hue and phthalo blue green shade that we see in the sky. I love doing these swatches on a piece of paper like this and taking some time to decide if all these colors have good color harmony and work well together. You can see by looking at this page that it gives you a certain look and a certain feel. And that really helps me understand if my colors will work towards this portrait and the storytelling I want to do in it. I want this painting to feel fresh and light and summery, and I like the way this palette reflects that. So now we're ready to start painting. My painting is 15 inches across by 22 inches high. I want to start off by painting the sky, and I find it easier to turn my page upside down so I have a much more convenient access to the sky. To paint a nice, smooth summer sky, I start off by watering down the whole sky shape. I've dirtied up my water a little bit so that it can show up better in this video. I'm using my bigger brush, which is the Black Gold 311 size 6. And I'm dunking it into my water cup, filling up the brush, and then painting as much water as quickly as I can across the sky shape. I'm painting carefully along the edges of the subject. I don't want to paint into that. For my sky, I'm going to use a mix of manganese blue hue and phthalo blue green shade. And phthalo colors are really staining, so I'm trying to avoid getting them anywhere I don't want. So I paint quickly with this loaded brush, and again, it's just water at this point. But despite painting quickly, I slow down to be careful around the edges, that contour of my drawing. Don't be stingy with your water. You want it to still be wet in the corner where you started by the time you finish the rest of the sky shape. And that's about half of this painting. That's a lot of paper that I want to keep wet as I then come back and paint in the sky. There's a little triangle of sky that falls behind the handlebars underneath his arm. So I paint that in as well with the water. Now that my whole shape is wet, I give the paper a chance to absorb that water. And in the meantime, off camera, I'm mixing a very watery puddle of manganese blue hue and phthalo blue green shade. I start in one corner and very quickly with the same large brush, I paint my way across the page very quickly. Having wetted my paper, I am painting wet into wet, and that makes sure that every time I put down some paint, it starts diffusing softly into the rest of the sky. I want to create as smooth of a summer sky as I can. Painting wet into wet definitely helps with that. And you can see just how quickly I'm moving my way across the paper. I would like to get the sky done in one pass without having to come in and do a second layer, as I want to keep it light in color and value. If, however, that doesn't work out, and as it dries, if there are any blemishes or problem areas, I can come in and re-wet it again and do another pass just like this of wet into wet. In order to do that though, you really have to let this first layer completely dry and then come in and do a second layer. If you start trying to correct it when the paper is not really wet and it's not completely dry, you're in a dangerous territory where you're likely to create blossoms, leaf brush marks, lift paint when you want to drop it in. So think about those two windows of time that are best for doing a second pass. Those are either when the paper is still totally wet or when the paper is totally dry. In those two situations, you can add a lot of paint to your paper and have it work out just fine. It's the in-between, when it's just barely damp, that we get into problem areas. While my paper is still damp, I pick it up and hold it up at different angles to let the paint slowly flow all over the sky. I watch the edges of the paper to make sure not too much water or paint is pooling up on the edges. If it is, I take a towel and just run it right along the edge to soak up that extra water and paint. Now I'm ready to let the sky completely dry. And I want to turn my attention to the grass and the hills. I start with that yellowy section on the left-hand side of the image because it's not touching the sky, which is still wet. I want to let that skyline dry with the hard edge. So I don't want to paint up next to it until it's completely dry. For this yellowy area, I'm mixing Pretty Watery Still, Hansa Yellow Light, and Burnt Sienna. It's important that when you think about creating your paintings, your background is not treated as an afterthought. You really want to think through what the background is contributing or detracting from your subject right from the start. Oftentimes people will paint a subject and then ask, well, what do I do with the background? And that just really means you haven't thought through the whole idea from the start the way you should have. And the background will end up looking like an afterthought. As I was looking at this reference photo and considering what to do with the background, I decided I love the idea of a young kid pedaling his way through these green hills on a summer day. But I'm very aware that the grass and the sky, basically the foreground and the background, are supporting characters at best in the story I'm telling. That the only real big character is going to be Iker on his bicycle. One way to make that apparent is to keep things that are secondary importance less in focus, less detailed, less contrast. So with those ideas in mind, I'm creating an impression of the grass using my 311 brush, size 2. It's still a rather big brush. I don't want to drill down into details of grass. I'm creating a few impressions of grass, keeping it very light in value, color, and soft on details. This will help keep our attention on the main subject. I use the same mix of Hansa Yellow Light with Burnt Sienna and add in a touch of sap green for the bigger grasses we see up front. I love the way they look in the photograph too, these tall pieces of grass at the very front, with them becoming smaller and smaller as we pull away into the distance, really helps add that sense of distance. I'm creating a few very quick gestural marks with my sap green, my Hansa yellow light, my burnt sienna, and I keep popping my brush into different puddles of color as I fill these in. I'm painting on dry paper, but the mixes of paint I'm using are quite watery. The video has been playing at twice the speed at which I was actually painting, but I'd like to speed it up slightly more since this is the same technique throughout this whole area. It's really common to bog down in the details when we're doing these sort of grassy landscapes, and I want to be sure not to do that. It's not a look I particularly like, and I really want to keep the surroundings loose in this painting. I'm painting quickly, and my mixes on my palette are very watery. I am following the reference photo somewhat for where the biggest patches of green are compared to the biggest patches of yellowy brown. And then there's that patch that is really dark on the bottom left-hand side. That's caused by the shadow that Iker and his bike are casting. And I want to make that area darker in my reference photo as well. So I pick up a little bit of French ultramarine blue and add it to my sap green. I tend to paint a few blades of grass, and then with watery mix or just water on my brush, I soften around them and fill up the spaces between the blades. As the paper starts to dry, I add thicker paint, just slightly thicker on my brush, and paint on a few more blades of grass. I let them diffuse into the damp areas so that I'm really giving more of an impression. Keeping in mind the rules of aerial perspective, those areas that are closest to us will be bigger than the details that are farther from us. They will also have more contrast and show more detail. The farther away the scene becomes from us, the less details we see, the less contrast we see. And I try to follow that rule to create a sense of distance in the foreground, into the middle ground, and finally into the background. By now the sky is dry and I can go ahead and paint the farthest hills that touch up against it. I had decided to get rid of the building in the background and created another sloping hill. The diagonal lines of my hills both point down towards Iker, and that is helping with the composition. He is front and center, the most important thing in this scene. For that back hill on the left-hand side, I'm using almost neat sap green, not mixed with a lot. I'm working fairly quickly and I'm painting with short brush strokes, recreating some of the texture that I see in the reference image. I don't really want these hills to be super smooth like my sky because then they would just be a big blanket of green. To create some texture, I'm sure to use short little brush strokes. With the background all painted in, I take a few minutes to assess where could I add some dark touches of detail or dark touches of color. And I go back to my reference photo to see if there are any areas I've missed. Most of the bottom part of my painting is dry now or barely damp. So I load up my brush with some thick sap green and start painting in a few of the blades of grass, making sure that the ones up front are taller and thicker, and as they pull back, they get shorter and thinner. I'm putting them where that dark shadow is that Iker and his bike are casting, and just a few up front to create more visual interest and give us a sense of place. I add water from a teardrop bottle, and by adding the water, as these blades of grass have started to dry onto the paper, I can come in with a barely damp brush and move that water around to soften a lot of these blades. I like adding variety to this foreground. It's really easy for green landscapes to become monotonous. So as I work my way across, adding a few details here and there, or deepening the color and the values here and there, I'm sure to keep changing the paint I'm using. I don't just keep painting out of a sap green puddle. Occasionally, I'll dip into the Hansa yellow light or the burnt sienna, or for the darker areas, even a touch of French ultramarine blue. Often it's the case that when we're painting the background and we haven't even started on our subject, such as in this demonstration, the background seems all important and we can overwork it and fuss with it way too much. But time after time, I've realized that once I start working on the subject, the background becomes much less important, and all that fussing was really not necessary. You can always come in and add more details after you're done painting your subject if you feel that it needs it. Remember that you can always play this back at a slower speed. If you're watching this on YouTube, towards the bottom right-hand side of your screen, there's a little icon that looks like a gear. If you click on it, one of the options is the playback speed, and you can play it back faster or slower. With these final brushstrokes, I'm ready to move on to painting Iker. I hope you'll join me in part 2 of this painting demonstration.